Hey folks, sorry I'm not here today. Some of you also won't see me tomorrow. So we'll cover today what made World War I, at least on the Western Front, so violent and awful. The Western Front is home to the most distinctive type of war associated with World War I. That's trench warfare. It's very hard to win, kind of like in our simulation. Defense had the huge advantage, so how is one side going to manage to pull out a victory? We'll see if we can figure that out today, or see if they figured it out. And tomorrow I'll give you a lecture on how it all does actually end. Short answer, the United States comes in. Ta-da! So let's look at today the Western Front. We won't spend time going over nitty-gritty battles and things like that. We'll just look at general things, a lot of pictures, gory stuff. You'll love it. So let's get started. If you've got that title down, we'll go forward. For starters, we should be at least vaguely familiar with the map of Germany, or I should say Europe, that you see up there, where you've got Germany and Austria-Hungary sort of sandwiched in between major Allied powers, the green colors here, the major countries that you participated in our simulation. As you've got Italy, France, Britain, that's your Sicily, Bordeaux, Newcastle. That's Germany and Austria-Hungary, so that's your Munich and your, oh gosh, Budapest. And Russia was Yalta. Some of the other colors on here don't really matter. You know, all these other green countries don't really do much. The Ottoman Empire was dying by that point, so while they do some stuff, it's really negligible. Most of the fighting is going on right around Germany, either on the western side, called the Western Front, or the eastern side, called the Eastern Front. Far different from one side to the other. As the war is unfolding, Germany understands the situation pretty clearly, same as you did when you looked at this map early on. Germany's in a bad position. It's surrounded. So its strategy is to try and beat one side first, specifically France, so that it can then focus only on Russia. So if we'd played out our simulation as it should have gone, sometimes goes like this. Munich would have allied with Budapest, that would be Germany allying with Austria-Hungary. Russia and France, or Yalta and Bordeaux, along with Newcastle, would have tried to close in on Germany, so they would have allied themselves together. But it works out differently every time. So Germany ends up trying to conquer France first, and it's almost successful. They stop just short of Paris, about 25 miles outside of Paris. They get stopped. It's interesting that they chose to stop. Nobody really knows quite why, at least I don't know. But that gives the Allied forces over here, Britain and France, a chance to get themselves set up, recover, and what happens is both sides dig trenches. That's what this thick red line is here on the left side of Germany, on the Western Front. This is about a 400-mile long line of trenches that develop on the western side of Germany and in France. For most of the rest of the war then, a lot of the fighting is simply going to be fighting over a few miles right here where this thick red line is, trying to get through the other side's trenches in some major way. And the basic answer is that that doesn't really happen. It's such a defensive war that it's hard to beat somebody when they're dug in a hole and they can shoot you, but you can't shoot at them. So the war takes this form of trench warfare pretty early on after the initial push by Germany. Once Britain and France recover, it's just trench warfare, and it's nasty for the next few years. As I said, I'll show you some pictures and tell you some stories about what that was like. The lines of trenches will pretty much show up like parallel lines on a map. I'll show you some pictures of this. There's a whole lot of slides in here, but really not much you have to write down. A lot of this stuff is pictures. So just follow along. Hopefully it makes sense and you find it at least somewhat interesting. First of all, this is a satellite picture of, shouldn't call it a satellite, balloon or plane picture from above of what some of the trenches look like. And if I were teaching you in class, I'd have you give me some feedback on what you notice in terms of the differences between these two sides. Couldn't tell you which side is the east side or the west side, but you've got one line of trenches over here on the right side and another enemy over here on the left side. This area in between I'll tell you about is called no man's land. This is where you did not want to be. You can kind of see it looks cratered. This dark color is not trees or bushes. This is just dirt. And some areas are wet. That's why they're darker. Some areas are drier. But overall, you might notice a difference between the trenches here and the trenches here. Check out, for example, the lines and how clear-cut the lines are on this side versus on this side. Seems like the right side is way more clear-cut. I'm pretty sure, actually, now that I'm talking about it and analyzing this picture, that the right side of this is Germany. So this is the western front. West would be this way, and this is probably a French or a British trench. Germans were known for making way better trenches. You may know Germans have a reputation for being great at engineering things and building things. They built some pretty sophisticated trenches, and you can kind of see that in just how clear-cut they are. The zigzag pattern you see here is useful because if a bomb were to land here, if it were a straight line, then the bomb would simply flow down, the force of that bomb would flow down that straight line. But by having the zigs and the zags, the bomb sort of hits these walls and doesn't spread nearly as far. It reduces the amount of damage. You can see that the British and the French troop lines or trench lines are not nearly as clear cut, so they were not as comfortable to be in, but really I don't know if any trench was comfortable. So just a few things to pay attention to that I think are interesting. I guess I'd also point out the secondary lines. This is the front line, so to speak. The first place where you're closest to the fighting, the front line. And you've got these secondary lines sort of weave behind the front lines parallel to each other. And in between, to connect them, you've got these, I guess you'd call them connecting trenches. Farther back, you've got the reserve line. Typical life for a soldier, typical schedule would be that if you were fighting, let's say, for a year, you'd spend about a quarter of the year, about 25% of the time on the front line, 25% on the secondary line, 25% on the reserve line, and then your other 25% you'd get time off. So here's what the trenches were like. They varied greatly in their length, their depth, their complexity. We'll see a lot of pictures. The most dangerous ones were the front line, and life was nasty. You don't have to write down all these details. I'd probably just write down that trenches were brutal to live in, that they were dirty, muddy, they were wet. Yeah, of course you know that sometimes you're going to get attacked and you might go and attack somebody and you or your buddies might die. Chances of that were pretty good. But the real nasty part of living in trenches was just living in a hole. I mean, if I were in class, I'd joke and tell you that I'd give anybody extra credit if they went and lived in a hole for a day. You'd get pretty tired of it pretty fast. So imagine doing that for weeks, months, years on end. It would be pretty nasty. Another major problem is just that since they are wet a lot of the time, because water flows to its lowest point, whenever it rains or if you just dug too far, your water would accumulate down at the bottom of the trench. There are some stories, and I'll show you some pictures of how this played out in some trenches for a lot of people, not just some trenches. Most everybody experienced this. First, I'll just say that when it's wet, your skin is softer, and you're more susceptible to cuts and things like that. So let's say that you have a blister or you actually have an injury and you're now surrounded by wetness all the time. That makes it very difficult for your wound to heal. Dryness is required for wounds to heal. So if it's wet all the time, your wound won't heal and it'll kind of fester and start to rot. That's really disgusting, of course. Other than that, just consider that if you had like wet shoes on or wet socks, I hate that. So imagine if that was just your life every day. There were some ways to avoid this. I'll show you some sophisticated designs of trenches that allowed for the water to be at the lowest point and you sort of walked on boards that were on top of that. But as the war proceeds and people just don't have time to maintain these trenches, build nice ones, one thing that some people did to keep their feet dry was that they would just take dead bodies of people around them and put them in the bottom of the trench. You'd just stand on those instead of standing in nasty, muddy, wet water or wet ground. So it was really nasty. Rats were terrible. People tell stories of how they would wake up middle of the night, have a rat chewing on their face. Rats will just thrive in this environment. They live underground. And they don't know the difference between a dead person and a sleeping human. So if they see you on the ground next to a dead person, they just might start chewing on your face. So just nasty. I mean, it's probably the worst war conditions that anyone's ever fought in, and it was just terrible. Lasts forever. There was seemingly no gain. It was all just an incredible, terrible waste of life. So in our simulation, when we talk about how war is really just a waste and you don't really gain much, it's true more than anywhere else, probably in the Western Front of World War I. So take a break for a second. You don't have to write anything down. I'll just tell you a bit about trenches. So this is a side view of a trench. The front line would be this way to the right. So let's say that this was the front line of your trench. The enemy is just over this way. You've got in a really nice trench, you've got your deepest part here at the bottom. This is your sump. If you have a sump pump in your home, it's a deep hole in your home where water gathers so it can be pumped out. Of course, there's no way to pump out this water, so you just stand on top of it. So they'll build a trench board that you'd walk on right on top of that. So you'd have some sort of wood at the bottom, and the water would be under that, so you're not getting your feet wet all the time. This was ideal. It was in no way common. This hole here would be for you to dive in if you heard that a bomb was coming. So this might protect you from a bomb. So it's just like a cutout in a wall of dirt. You got another one here in the front. You had like a stand to stand on, some sandbags, and you might shoot a machine gun out from behind this, or perhaps shoot your rifle out over the top here. You've got other defenses that are going to prevent people from getting to you, like barbed wire. This was a relatively new invention during this time. So were machine guns. So you can see or understand how defense would have a huge advantage. They're basically just hidden in a hole. They've got all these obstacles for the enemy to overcome as they try to get into their trench. They're dodging machine gun fire. It's not really much dodging. So the trenches were built for defense, not built for comfort. And this will make the war long-lasting, painful, nasty. Ah, yes, trench foot. This guy's feet have rotten. There's several different pictures of people's feet here, but this is what happens if you have wet feet for too long, and especially an injury. It's disgusting. The feet you see in the top left lack toes. They have simply rotten off. Rotted off? I don't know if that's a verb. Kind of like the ones on the top here. And that foot, oh man, that's nasty. So this was one of the major ailments in World War I. If you were just wet for too long, your skin would just start to rot, especially if you had an injury. Ugh. Don't write down any of this stuff. This is not for you to know on a test. I just think it's kind of interesting. So we'll spend just a minute telling you a little bit more about what life was like. Enemy trenches from front line to front line would be anywhere from 30 feet to 2 miles away. Usually you'd have about 3 or 4 football fields that you'd have to cross if you wanted to get from your trench to the enemy's trench. So imagine having to run 300 or 400 yards to get to your enemy's trench, and all in the in that space you're getting shot at. There are bombs blowing up around you. You're hopping over or under barbed wire. There's giant craters in the ground you need to crawl in and out of, or might stumble into. Some spots are wet. There's dead trees, tree trunks. There's dead people. None of this is easy or pleasant. So the chances of you getting to the other side were pretty slim. That area then was called no man's land because you didn't want to be there. Filled with all sorts of obstacles and things that would kill you. Before an attack, there was a strategy to try and make it more likely that you would succeed. The strategy was called softening up. You'd have these giant guns. They're called artillery guns. They're the ones that kind of sound like this, where you're shooting a big shell up in the air a super long distance. They might shoot for 2 miles. And so you could shoot somebody else far away and have these huge explosions. This would happen for days or weeks. The idea was that you'd hopefully destroy so much of the enemy's trenches that by the time you got up out of your trench and went to the other side, there'd be like nobody left. You'd be able to take that land without really anybody to shoot at you. So you'd bomb the other side for days and days and days, and I do mean days, nonstop. And then when the signal came, the bombs would stop, and you'd get up out of your trench and try to take the enemy's trench. Thousands of men all at once would overwhelm the other side, or at least try to. This usually didn't work. The reason was because the trenches by some sides were actually so good that it didn't really matter how much you bombed them. you'd still be able to survive underground, and your reserve trenches and secondary line trenches would still have enough people. So once the bombing stopped, you just knew, well, there's got to be a huge surge of people coming over any time now. So you'd get up out of your holes, you'd man your machine guns, and then you just mow down these people who thought that you weren't there anymore. This happened time after time. It was not a very good strategy, and this wasn't something that the generals or the officers in the war really realized. The simple strategy, or the problem they thought, was that they just either didn't bomb the other side for long enough, or they didn't send enough men. So as the war evolves, it just becomes this, you just see this pattern of longer and longer bombings, more and more men being sent, more and more men being lost, and nothing changes. So it's not until a long time into the war that people realize that there's really just no way that this strategy is ever going to work. A lot of soldiers, understandably, then became scared to go over the top of the front line, to go into no man's land. There's some stories that if you refuse to go over, your commanding officer would just shoot you. So if you don't go over and try and attack the other side, you're going to die anyway. Fighting at least usually stopped at night. And surprisingly, although this sounds, in some ways exciting, of course it's not exciting, it was horrible. One surprising thing to many people about World War I, it was actually pretty darn boring most of the time. I'll show you something in next class, just some World War I diaries that were written. We'll see if we can find some interesting ones. But most of the time, people were just bored. You either were getting resupplied, or fixing trenches, or marching, or just waiting for something to happen. It would be like 99% boredom and 1%, oh my God, am I going to die? So World War I is exciting as it seems, really was not great. Just imagine how nasty or awful that would have been to be in a trench then in World War I. You're dirty, you're wet, and you're bored most of the time. It doesn't get much worse than that. We'll skip this stuff about trenches. This just shows you more of a detailed diagram of what some of these trenches would have been like. So you have your front line trench, you've got your second line trench, your communication trench between, your officers would hang out there. Maybe you have a typewriter to type up reports for generals or things like that. Similar sort of idea. You've got your barbed wire in front of the front line, a machine gun house shooting people from far away, and then even farther back you've got your long-range artillery, these big cannons that would shoot shells for miles in many cases. This is a picture that was taken early in the war. I believe these are British troops. They're maybe French, but they're certainly not German. And some things about this picture may tip you off that this was from early on in the war. I think there's a few parts of this picture that make it clear that this was not very long into the war. See if you can figure it out. Stare at it for a few seconds. Anything you can pick up on that makes this seem pretty clearly an early part of the war? Notice things in the background. It's far away and blurry, but you can probably tell what that is. So a lot of fighting in World War I will take place just in farm fields that troops will just set themselves in. 400 miles, you're going to cover a lot of ground. Most of it's just going to be farmland. And the longer the war goes on, the worse the land gets. All these bombs going off everywhere, the land just becomes pretty poor quality. The trenches will get pretty poor as well, but they'll generally be deeper as the war goes on, as people try to protect themselves. So notice that in this picture you've got pretty shallow trenches. They're really hardly even deep enough for a man to stand upright in without the risk of getting shot. So looks like these trenches are pretty new. They're pretty poor quality as a side note. That also tips me off that they're French or British. We said the Germans had pretty good trenches. The helmets they have are British, I believe, so that's a tip off. But back to the topic, how do we know that this is new early on in the war? Other than the depth of the trenches being shallow, notice in the background you've still got trees, grass, and bushes. As the war goes on, all this land will just be devastated. There's no way you could grow anything on it. Holes in the ground, shells everywhere, dead trees. You would not find a blade of grass in many places at all, much less a tree. So this was early on in the war. These days, some trenches still exist. Understandably, after the war is over, lots of farmers are just going to want to get back to farming. So they'll, in many cases, just fill in the trenches. Well, one guy that my parents saw when they went on a trip to Belgium a couple years ago had this desire to keep his land as it was in World War I, and this is some of that land. So you can still see some of the remnants of the early trenches, and these days he has basically the only trenches left in Belgium that are still World War I real trenches. And just to give you an idea of how many bombs were dropped every day in Belgium, every day, 100 years later, people still have shells coming up out of the ground, whether they're spent shells, ones that actually exploded, that are still sitting there and slowly being barfed up by the ground, or they still find unexploded shells. And if you want to do something interesting, just go to Google real quick and type in something like World War I bomb found or World War I bomb explodes. Seems like just about every year people are killed in Europe still by bombs from World War I that are found or become reach the surface level, or you're doing construction somewhere and they get hit by a construction vehicle. So World War I is still killing people. Just millions and millions of shells were spent, and not every one exploded, and they're still all coming up from the ground. So there's still a lot of history that's alive and well in many parts of Europe. When the 100th anniversary of World War I came last year, in the last few years, we've had several centennial celebrations in different countries. It's still a pretty serious issue in a lot of countries. They've gotten over their old rivalries by this point after 2 world wars, but everyone knows that there were huge sacrifices made, and this was an unprecedented conflict. So I realize I'm probably droning on to some of you by this point, but the history is still very real to lots and lots of people, and going and visiting some of these sites at least gives you a better feeling of what it would have been like to be there. It's kind of cool to have some of these places still around. Some nice trenches were built kind of like this, but these were few and far between. You can see these have brick. Nobody would have really had time to do this, so this is a pretty rare example. So last things to write down then will be how they tried to end the war. They won't be successful, but there were a lot of different attempts. Most of them will be unsuccessful. One example I've already given you here, just sending more and more men. You don't have to write down all these words. You can just say, well, they just tried to send more and more men. It never worked. It always just cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Here's a couple examples. You don't have to know these for the test, so again, they're really just for your amusement. But there's a battle in France that lasted for 10 months, the Battle of Verdun. During these 10 months, there were 1 million casualties. So casualties doesn't mean you're dead, it means you're wounded or dead. So 1 million people were at the very least wounded in a 10-month span. Another example, Battle of the Somme, also that same year, lasts for 4 or 5 months. Also, roughly 1 million casualties in 4 or 5 months. So the death tolls, the injuries were just stunning. So many people were injured. There's some really interesting stuff to hear about this, like how prosthetics evolved after World War I, because so many people lacked arms or parts of their faces. That medicine will improve in a lot of ways thanks to World War I, but it's a pretty steep price to pay for some of these improvements. Some ways that these countries fighting then tried to win would include trying to fight somewhere else. So if you can't get through the trenches, why don't you go fight somewhere else? These were not very successful either. So the main thing we'll talk about then, about how they tried to end the war, was just by trying new weapons. We haven't really gone into great detail yet, but World War I is going to be remarkable for lots of reasons, and one reason is because so many new weapons were debuted, in many cases for the first time, or for the first time on such a large scale. The hope was that if you came up with some amazing new weapon, you would then have something that gives you a big advantage over your enemy. In reality, a lot of these weapons were too crude to be effective quite yet. For example, I'll show you some pictures of early tanks. While they were effective at rolling over trenches and they were not easily defeated by bullets, they broke down a lot of the time, and some of them could still be easily blown up by mines or bombs. So tanks didn't really work that well. Planes will be used, and they won't really be that effective. They'll mostly be used for flying over the enemy's trenches to see what they're planning or what they're building or what resources they have. Other weapons I'll show you were also not super effective because they'll just be too primitive at this point in time. But it was really a place to showcase new advances in science, and most famous of all probably would have been the advances in chemical warfare and poison gas. So let's look at some of these things. Of course, you may have heard of the Red Baron, not just known for his pizza. Of course, he didn't make pizza. He had his famous German plane, and so did the British and the French. That's the Red Baron there in the corner. He's dead now. Flamethrowers were new in this war. If you don't know what a flamethrower is like, you can check out some videos on YouTube. Pretty scary stuff. They'll be even better in World War II, but a World War I flamethrower could easily shoot flames about 50 feet away from you, so that would be pretty terrifying. Machine guns, we already talked about, were new at this time, or relatively new. These guns, like this one, called a Maxim gun, could fire somewhere around 500 bullets in a minute. So do the math, 60 seconds, that's about 10 bullets a second. That's pretty hard to overcome. We'll also see grenades, tons of other things like submarines. That's other countries use submarines, but the Germans were best known for them. They were called U-boats. And Zeppelins. These were really useless. This is a giant balloon. How do you think you can beat a giant balloon? I don't know. Poke a hole in it? So these often get shot down, but like planes, they're often just used for spying. So we've got a new form of ship warfare. We've got air war becoming a thing, even though Zeppelins didn't do much fighting. Planes started to do that stuff. These are what some of the early tanks looked like. They were invented by the British. As I told you, they were pretty much ineffective, but for a short time they were pretty good until they broke down. And most famously, I told you, is poison gas. It's so bad that it will be banned after World War I. See if you can guess. Why would poison gas have been a terrible weapon to use? I mean, other than the fact that it kills you. I mean, that's really no different than any other weapon, right? I mean, that's the point of a weapon. It's supposed to kill somebody. So the deaths were painful, maybe unnecessarily so, but there's something else about them that seems really stupid. As a sort of corollary, imagine if you shot a bullet and it came back at you. Poison gas wasn't very effective for one reason. If the wind changed direction, you now had a very bad problem on your hands. So for this reason and others, mostly the cruelty that people seem to see with poison gas, it's banned after World War I. Still not allowed today, and yet you still see it in the news in Syria, where there's a civil war going on. The leader of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, President Assad, has been accused of, and it's essentially been proven that he used poison gas to kill some of his own people who were fighting against him in the civil war. So still a problem in the world today, but certainly an issue in World War I before it was banned. I'll show you what it looked like if you were attacked with poison gas, kind of describe it for you. There were a few different types of poison gas. Oh, look at that. You have gas masks. You got dogs with gas masks. Look at how cute they are. Oh, adorable. You have horses with gas masks. That horse looks terrified. They're dead now. Anyway, this is what mustard gas would do to you. Mustard gas was one of three types of gas. Another major type was chlorine gas. Mustard gas would give you severe burns. It wouldn't kill you that often. It was usually just meant to get you out of the battlefield, just injure you to the point where you couldn't fight anymore. So you can see here these people have like boils on their skin. Their skin just burned so much that it started to bubble. The chlorine gas is a little bit different. Chlorine gas was meant to drown you in your own lung fluid. If you breathed it in, it basically melted the insides of your lungs, which has all this fluid in it. You may not think of this, but your lungs have fluid in them. It's called pulmonary fluid. And if your lungs sort of melt in the inside, then this fluid is released and you can't breathe anymore. So you just drown because your lungs are drowning in their own fluid. Fun stuff. Really great stuff. So if we had time for an exit slip in class today, I'd ask you to answer this question. What made World War I violent? Well, I've given you a bunch of different answers to this. The most obvious thing I just told you about was, of course, tons of different weapons that just made war way more violent. There were really bad strategies by generals. So just send more men. Our strategy didn't work. Maybe we just needed more men. If you carry this on forever, you just end up seeing these huge numbers like we saw for those battles of millions of casualties in a matter of just a few months. Trench warfare was a very defensive war, so it was very difficult for anybody to win. So we'll carry on in our next lecture just with how this actually all manages to end. I've already told you the short answer to that, but there's a little bit more to it. Why does the U.S. get involved? This isn't our war, so why do we end up getting involved? We'll cover that another day. Hopefully this made sense to you and was interesting. Cover the rest of the stuff on the assignment sheet, or I should say in the assignment center. I think there's just a section for you to read. Just pay attention to that, and I'll see you guys soon. Have a great day. Bye.